Chapter 2. Dimensions. Okay, let's get started unwrapping this tangled up mess of questions that surround our world and make us what we are. As you can see by the title of this chapter, we'll be starting with an understanding of dimensions. Seems pretty intimidating to start out with a topic so large and misunderstood, but that's all the more reason to start here. If we climb this hill first, the rest of this should run pretty smoothly. Trust me, I got you. When someone hands you a ruler or tape measure and asks you to get the dimensions of something, what are they asking for? We all know the answer to this. We are to take the ruler/tape measure and measure that something in length, width, and height. 3 dimensions. So, we are all aware that we live in the 3-dimensional world, because this is what we are capable of measuring and witnessing. In order to measure this object, we would need to either spin the object around, move our heads for another perspective, or walk around it to measure all sides. We can't just look at it from one side and measure all sides, because it wouldn't be an accurate measurement. We actually have to move around the object or spin the object around to get a view of all sides in order to see it from all angles to measure it. What does this prove? It proves that we can only see in 2 dimensions. You can sit with an easel and some paint, then paint an exact image of what you are seeing onto a canvas. A perfect replica of what we see can be put onto a surface that only has 2 dimensions, length and width. Pretty simple to understand thus far, right? So, what makes us aware that we live in a world with 3 dimensions? Light coming from a direction, bouncing off of objects, and the ability to look at things from all angles by us moving around it. Take the same painting on your canvas and shine a light on it. The subject matter in your painting isn't affected by the light, other than the light reflecting off of the paint or the canvas itself, because it's 2-dimensional. It has no depth. Try to imagine a world where light doesn't come from a specific defined point like a sun or a light bulb. A world where you can see normally, but there is no shadows. Would you still believe that you lived in a 3-dimensional world from just looking? When things got closer to you, they would just seem like they were getting larger, and when things moved away from you, they would get smaller. No real perception of depth at all. A sphere would just look like a circle, and a cube would look like a square. Without a defined point of light, it would seem as though we were living in a cartoon, a 2-dimensional viewpoint. Light is what defines everything that we see or don't see and how we perceive it. So what is 1-dimensional and 2-dimensional, then? 1-dimensional would be a point. A dot with no length or width. A dot that has no understanding of anything. A dot that cannot see beyond itself, or that has no awareness whatsoever of anything else around it, not even other dots. This does not mean that this dot has no reaction or that it is immobile, but it means that this dot is only capable of reacting to its surroundings. By the example shown through the explanation of 3 dimensions, where we are only able to see in 2D in a 3-dimensional world, a dot would only be able to see into the 0, 0 dimension, nothingness, a void. 2-dimensional, well, we kind of hit on the second through the explanation of the third. 2-dimensional would be lines or connections between first-dimensional dots/points. No height, only length and width. An accumulation of dots or points together create the 2nd-dimension world. The 2nd dimension would have an understanding of the 1st dimension and be able to see the reactions from the points. Are you familiar with comic books? Way back in the day, the pictures in comic books were colored in this fashion. Millions and millions of dots together creating pictures that were, of course, 2-dimensional. This is not a perfect example, but will assist in the visualization of the worlds below our own. It is the points in the 1st dimension, accumulated together, that make up the 2nd dimension, and the 2nd dimension is then layered upon itself over and over to create the 3rd dimension. Think of it like this: a piece of paper would represent the 2nd dimension. Length and width, no height. But, if you were place multiple pieces of paper on top of one another, you would create a stack of paper, giving it height, creating a 3-dimensional object. Every part of this stack is dependent upon the other. If the points were to remove themselves from this equation, then the paper would fall apart, thus breaking apart the 3D object, the stack, causing the whole thing to break down. So, collectively, we've established that we, in the third dimension, can only see in 2D. Two-dimensional beings/objects can only see in 1D, and one-dimensional beings/objects cannot see beyond themselves and can only have a view/understanding of the naught, zero, dimension, a void. Therefore, we can only truly understand, in its entirety, the dimension below the dimension in which we live. There, of course, is more to dimensions than this, however it is only a basic understanding of this concept that I'm trying to portray to this point. Now we move on to the fourth dimension. There are a few theories as to what the fourth dimension is, but as I said before, we can only truly understand, to its fullest, the dimension below our own. However, there is a pattern that I believe we all can agree on. The third dimension must affect the fourth, and the fourth can see/understand the third dimension in its entirety. Looking at our three-dimensional world from the fourth dimension, we would be able to see everything in the third dimension without having to walk around it or turning it to see it. We would be able to observe right through our three-dimensional selves and everything in our third-dimensional world, observing every angle from one perspective from the fourth dimension. Here, in the third dimension, we have length, width, and height, but what about the fourth? What dimension would be thrown on top of length, width, and height that can be measured? Just like the progression of the previous dimensions, there would need to be an addition of another dimension, which from the fourth dimension, can be measured. Perhaps time would be the next dimension. In our 3D world, we can't see time. Time is not something that can be manipulated in the third dimension. There is no tool that I can pull out of my pocket to cut time, nor is there a way for us to manipulate it from our 3D world. We would need to be above the third to see time and above the fourth dimension to actually manipulate time. Ever had a déjà vu moment? Most of us have. Déjà vu is when you have a dream that you don't quite remember, then the event taking place in your dream manifests itself into your life, bringing on the feelings and experience that you had in your dream. Most of us have experienced this at one time or another in our lives. This means that at some point, most likely in our sleep or a similar state, we have been given a glimpse of our future. This occurrence happens so much that all we have to say is déjà vu, and anyone within range of hearing the comment knows exactly what you're talking about. People like to shrug this off as nothing spectacular, but in fact, it is proof of exactly what I'm explaining to you. From the fourth dimension, we are able to observe time. We are capable of witnessing the future, as brief as it may be in a déjà vu, which means we are able to leave our three-dimensional world during a state of sleep or unconsciousness and see it from a different viewpoint, the fourth dimension. I will be getting more into this a bit later. Let's move on to the next. The fifth dimension. This is where we start to lose sight of what's really going on through the sciences that we know. We may be able to grab a glimpse into the world directly above us, but the thought processes of the human mind limit us and make it very difficult to comprehend beyond that point, with accuracy anyway. If a view from the fourth dimension would be able to look into the third dimension, capable of seeing everything that makes it up, from the electrons creating every atom up to the largest planet in our universe at any time period within, then the view from fifth dimension would be able to see into the fourth, able to witness not only time, but perhaps every possible outcome of every decision throughout time contained within it. Following me so far? Now for the sixth. What science has put together is that at some point, a multiverse is created. A multiverse is exactly what it sounds like. Multiple universes existing around our own. Much like planets orbiting our sun, the ideas of a multiverse would be along the same lines. A multitude of universes orbiting around a central energy, just like the electrons inside an atom. Each universe consisting of the same dimensions that we have, only the view from the sixth dimension would bring on another perspective. A view of all the universes and every possible outcome in time within each, maybe? Getting the pattern yet? Each dimension consists of each lower dimension within itself. Scientists claim this process goes on and on until it reaches the 10th. This is where scientists have claimed that the process ends, the 10th. They claim that there is an absolute beginning, or end, from our viewpoint, to this dimensional hierarchy, bringing our existence and everything in between, back to one source. What each dimension is and is capable of beyond our own, is theoretical, however their existence is factual. What a lot of people believe, is that the dimensions get bigger as they go outward, meaning that from the first dimension to the 10th, a visual representation would resemble a cone. The tip of the cone being the first dimension and the broad end of the cone would be the 10th. I'm sure not all have rested on this visual perception of the theory, but it seems as though this is a widely accepted concept. It makes sense that worlds within worlds would be represented in this manner. Every dimension would have to fit inside all of the others, so it would make sense for the dimensions to get larger as we go further up the dimensional ladder. I do not agree with this fully, but then again, I'm not a scientist by any means. Since this part of the explanation is still open for theories, I might as well throw out my own. Here's mine. A visual representation of how the dimensions are laid out and how they surround a dimension cannot be fully imagined with our 3D minds. If it were, then we'd probably have an understanding of this already. In order to imagine the dimensions working together, you'd have to create numerous diagrams and cram the ideas together into one. One diagram would look like the rings inside a tree trunk or inside of an onion. The first dimension would be in the center and the 10th would be on the outer rim. The second diagram, there would be a cone. The tip of the cone would be the first dimension and the broad end would be the 10th dimension. The third diagram would be layers upon each other, much like blankets laying on top of one another. In all of these diagrams, every dimension would affect the others. For example, if you were to push your finger through the top layer of dimensions, this would cause your fingerprint to bleed through to all of the other dimensions, affecting all of them in some way. Right now, with the limited understanding that we have on Earth as three-dimensional beings, we are able to get a glimpse outside of our own dimension and even make our own creations within our own dimension, being able to emulate anything we are surrounded by. We create seemingly three-dimensional worlds via our computers on a regular basis for TV shows, movies, games, etc. Played any video games lately? Video games are a great example of this. We take control of a character and can walk through a 3D-looking world which has artificial intelligence that rivals some human intelligence in quite a few cases that you can interact with. A world within our own world, built with programming code by humans. There are simulations that can run real-life circumstances, and can grab our attention away from the reality that we know in order to experience them. Our great minds on this planet have figured out how to recode DNA within everything that exists on this planet, even cloning or recreating animals, plants, and dare I say, humans. Quite astonishing really. Beings, like us, who only have access to less than 20% of full capabilities of our own DNA and brains, only being able to understand or see one dimension below our own, 2D, to its fullest, are capable of manipulating, creating, and recreating everything that surrounds us with almost perfect accuracy. But what created us,